Overclocking your video card. How far can you push it? Does overclocking the core or the memory get you a better performance boost? How much of a benefit are you likely to see if you overclock both of them by 10%? Well, in today's video, that's exactly what we find out. We'll be using a GTX 1070 and a GTX 980 Ti, playing at both 1440p and 4K. Our GTX 980 Ti, we were able to overclock both the core and the memory by exactly 10%, taking our memory speed from 7004 MHz up to 7714, and our core clock, which was boosting to 1380 MHz by default, up to 1518 MHz on the core. Impressive considering it's on stock voltage. For our GTX 1070, we were able to overclock the boosted speed of 1898 MHz by 6.7% up to 2025 MHz, and we overclocked our memory from 8014 MHz by 6% up to 8496 MHz. Using stock settings in 4K on our GTX 1070, we had a minimum frame rate of about 65 frames per second, an average of almost 77, and a maximum of almost 91 frames per second. By increasing the core 6.7%, we saw on average a 2 to 3% gain in all areas. However, by overclocking just the memory by 6%, the minimum frame rate barely budged at all. The average frame rate went up by roughly 2%, and the maximum frame rate went up almost 10%, more than we overclocked by. When overclocking both the core and the memory by 6 to 6.7%, the minimum frame rate went up 3.5%, the average went up 5%, our maximum frame rate went up over 12%, bringing our average gain to about 5% or an additional 4 frames per second. Testing our 980 Ti in 1440p, we saw a minimum frame rate of roughly 75 frames per second, an average of almost 97 frames per second, and a maximum of roughly 122 frames per second. Overclocking the core by 10% did bring up our minimum frame rate by a healthy 8%, our average by 4%, and it only moved the maximum frame rate by 0.5%. Overclocking the memory by 10% only brought everything up by roughly 1.5% across the board. Overclocking both, we were able to bring up our minimum frame rate by almost 12%, our average frame rate by about 7%, and our maximum frame rate by about 3%. It should be worth noting that with the 980 Ti overclock we achieved, which was 10% on both the core and the memory over what it was boosting to normally, those clocks were stable on stock voltage for games only. When it came to any kind of data mining, those clocks were not stable unless we fed it additional voltage, which will shorten the life of the card, so we did not include those in this video. So, to answer the question, does a 10% overclock give you a 10% boost in your games? Not really. Now, overclocking your memory will improve your maximum frame rate more than the core clock, usually. And you get a better minimum frame rate if you bring up your core speed. If you bring them both up by 10% together, we only saw about a 3 to 4% increase, which isn't as much of a boost as we were hoping for. So I hope that answers your questions. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed having an excuse to play a bunch of games all day. As always, like this video if you liked it, share this video with those who may not have seen this yet, and don't forget to check out some of our other videos, and check us out on Facebook. Hit us up with any ideas you'd love to see turned into a video. We'll see you next time.